Right now, wherever you are, your body is doing something remarkable. Without you thinking about it, without any conscious effort at all, your core temperature is holding steady at about 37 degrees Celsius. Your heart is pumping warm blood to your fingertips, your toes, the tip of your nose. You are, essentially, a furnace wrapped in skin. But here is the thing. The moment you fall asleep tonight, that furnace starts turning down. Your core temperature will drop by nearly half a degree. Your blood vessels will dilate, pushing warmth out toward your skin. Your metabolism will slow. Your body will essentially choose to become more vulnerable to the cold at the exact moment you stop being able to do anything about it. Now imagine doing that in Antarctica, where the average winter temperature sits at minus 51 degrees Celsius, where winds can reach 200 miles per h-hour, where the darkness lasts for months without a single sunrise. Imagine closing your eyes and trusting that you would wake up again. If you are settling in for the night, perfect. These stories have waited more than a century. They can wait a little longer while you get comfortable. Subscribe and stick around. The first people to ever sleep through an Antarctic winter did not plan to. In 1897, a Belgian expedition led by Adrien de Gerlache sailed south aboard a converted Norwegian whaler called the Belgica. Among the crew were two men who would later become famous for very different reasons. The ship's doctor was an American named Frederick Cook. The first mate was a young Norwegian named Roald Amundsen. In March of 1898, the Belgica became trapped in the pack ice of the Bellingshausen Sea. Whether de Gerlache sailed into the ice deliberately remains debated. What is certain is that 19 men suddenly found themselves facing something no human beings had ever experienced. A full winter below the Antarctic Circle, with no way out. The crew slept aboard the ship in bunks that were never designed for these conditions. The Belgica had been insulated with felt during its refit. But as winter closed in, moisture from the men's breathing condensed on every interior surface. Ice formed on the ceiling above their bunks. Their blankets grew damp. Their clothes never fully dried. The temperature inside the ship hovered, barely above freezing. On May 17th, the sun disappeared below the horizon. It would not return for 70 days. Within weeks, the crew began to unravel. They were perpetually cold, perpetually damp, perpetually crowded together in the dark. One sailor suffered a complete mental breakdown and had to be committed to an institution when he finally returned home. Another crew member, a Belgian officer named Emile Danco, died of heart failure brought on by the stress and cold. Dr. Cook emerged as the unlikely savior. He recognized that the combination of darkness, cold, and inactivity was destroying the men from the inside out. He ordered them to eat fresh seal and penguin meat to fight scurvy, which de Gerlache had initially refused. He organized card games and activities to keep their minds occupied, and he insisted the men spend time standing near an open fire, absorbing what little warmth they could before crawling into their frozen bunks each night. Cook also made an observation that would prove prophetic. He noticed that the men who slept the worst were the ones who spent the most time lying in their bunks during the day. Inactivity bred poor sleep, which bred more inactivity, which bred worse sleep. It was a downward spiral that could kill as surely as frostbite. Cook forced the men to exercise on deck, even in the bitter cold, specifically so they would sleep better at night. He was practicing sleep hygiene a century before anyone coined the term. The crew also improvised their sleeping arrangements as winter progressed. They discovered that sleeping closer together provided significantly more warmth than sleeping alone. They fashioned additional blankets from seal skins hunted before the animals migrated north for winter. They stuffed newspaper and spare clothing into the gaps around their bunks to block drafts. Every small improvement could mean the difference between shivering through the night and getting enough rest to function the next day. Think about that. These men had no sleeping bags designed for polar conditions, no insulated tents, no understanding of how their bodies were losing heat. They were learning through raw experience, something that science would only later confirm, that the human body loses heat in 4 distinct ways. Conduction, which is direct transfer from your body to a colder surface. Convection, where moving air strips heat from your skin. Radiation, where your body simply emits warmth into the space around it. And evaporation, where moisture on your skin carries heat away as it dries. In a normal bedroom, these processes are gentle. You lose a little heat to your mattress, a little to the air. Your blankets trap a layer of warm air around you and everything stays comfortable. But in Antarctica, every one of these mechanisms turns lethal. The ground beneath you is ice, conducting heat away from your body at an astonishing rate. The wind tears warmth from any exposed skin, and the dry air pulls moisture from your breath, your clothes, your sleeping bag, creating a cycle of dampness and cold that never ends. Your body fights back, of course. When your core temperature begins to drop, your hypothalamus, that almond-sized region deep in your brain, triggers a cascade of responses. Blood vessels in your extremities constrict, pulling warm blood toward your vital organs. Your muscles begin to shiver, tiny contractions that generate heat through friction. Your thyroid releases hormones to speed up your metabolism. Goosebumps raise the hair on your skin, a vestige from our furry ancestors that once trapped a layer of warm air close to the body. But all of these defenses have limits. Shivering can increase heat production by up to 5 times your resting rate, but it also burns enormous amounts of energy. A person shivering intensely for hours will exhaust their caloric reserves far faster than someone at rest. This is why the explorers ate such staggering quantities of food. Scott's men consumed roughly 4,500 calories per Dalton Y on the trail, and it still was not enough. Their bodies were burning fuel faster than they could replace it, and the deficit showed up most dangerously during sleep. The Belgica expedition survived, barely, when the sun finally returned and the ice began to break up. Cook organized the crew to saw a channel 600 meters through the pack ice to reach open water. They escaped in March of 1899 after 13 months trapped in the ice. But the psychological scars lasted decades, and the lessons they learned about sleeping in extreme cold would prove essential for every expedition that followed, because the next generation of explorers would push deeper into Antarctica than anyone had gone before. And they would need something far better than ship bunks and wool blankets to survive. They would need sleeping bags. But not the kind you might imagine. The standard sleeping bag of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration was made from reindeer skin. The bags were roughly 8 feet long and 30 inches wide, cut to the approximate shape of the human body, with a round hole for the face covered by a flap that closed toward the feet. The fur was worn on the inside, against the sleeper's body. They weighed about 15 pounds when dry, which sounds manageable until you learn what happened to them after a few weeks on the ice. Here is the problem that no one fully anticipated. When you sleep in a reindeer skin bag in sub-zero temperatures, your body heat melts the frost inside the bag. That moisture soaks into the fur. When you climb out in the morning, the moisture freezes solid. The bag becomes a rigid board of frozen leather and ice. By the time you need to sleep again, you have to physically force your way into what has essentially become a frozen coffin. The explorer Apsley Cherry Garrard described this process in agonizing detail. On his journey to Cape Crozier in the winter of 1911, temperatures dropped to -77.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is -60.8 Celsius. He wrote that it sometimes took the men 45 minutes to chop their way into their sleeping bags at night. Once inside, the ice would melt from their body heat, and they would lie in freezing puddles for 7 shivering hours. Cherry Garrard, along with Edward Wilson and Henry Bowers, had set out from Cape Evans in the dead of the Antarctic winter. Their mission was to collect emperor penguin eggs for scientific research. The birds nested at Cape Crozier, 60 miles away, and they laid their eggs in the coldest, darkest months of the year. The 3 men hauled their sledges through complete darkness in temperatures that made their teeth shatter in their mouths. The surface conditions were so poor that they could not drag both sledges at once, so they hauled one sledge forward, walked back, and hauled the second. For every mile of progress, they walked 3 miles. In 8 hours of exhausting labor, they might cover 1.5 miles. And each evening, they had to make camp, light a stove, melt snow for water, cook their food, and force their bodies into those frozen sleeping bags. The process of making camp was itself an ordeal. Their tent had frozen stiff and took enormous effort to erect. Their fingers were too numb to tie knots, so they learned to do everything with the heels of their hands. The primus stove took precious minutes to light because the matches were at the same temperature as the air, roughly 100 degrees of frost, and the smallest touch of metal on bare skin caused instant frostbite. Cherry Garrard wrote that he sometimes went through 4 or 5 boxes of matches before one would strike. Think about that for a second. It was so cold that the pus inside their frostbite blisters froze. Their breath formed a solid wall of ice across their mouths. Cherry Garrard once raised his head to look around and found he couldn't move it back. His clothing had frozen rigid in perhaps 15 seconds. For 4 hours, he had to haul his sledge with his head stuck upright, because the ice would not allow him to bend. And each night, after these days of unimaginable exertion, they had to crawl into those frozen bags and try to sleep. Cherry Garrard wrote of lying there, shaking with cold until his back felt like it would break. Hour after hour, night after night, the sleeping bags grew heavier as they accumulated more ice. By the end of the journey, each bag weighed several times its original weight, and the men were getting frostbitten inside them. When they finally reached Cape Crozier, they built an improvised shelter from rocks with a canvas roof on the slopes of Mount Terror. From this base, they made their way down to the penguin colony and collected 5 eggs. But then a Force 11 blizzard struck. The wind tore away their tent and carried it off into the darkness. The canvas roof of their stone shelter followed a day later. The 3 men lay in their sleeping bags as snow buried them, singing hymns and songs above the howling wind to keep their spirits alive. For 2 days they lay there, fully expecting to die, and then the storm cleared. By almost miraculous chance, they found their tent lodged in a snowdrift half a mile away. They retrieved it, broke 2 of their 5 eggs getting back to the shelter, and began the return journey to Cape Evans with 3 surviving specimens. Cherry Garrard's teeth had shattered from chattering in the cold. All 3 men were barely alive when they staggered back to base 5 weeks after they had left. But here is where it gets really interesting. Not everyone suffered equally, and the reason reveals something fundamental about how survival in extreme cold actually works. When Roald Amundsen set out for the South Pole in 1911, he dressed his men in clothing modeled on Inuit designs. Loose-fitting reindeer skin parkas worn over the head with built-in hoods and long tails. Fur trousers, fur boots stuffed with dried grass for insulation. He had spent years studying how indigenous Arctic peoples had solved the problem of sleeping in extreme cold, and he applied their wisdom methodically. Robert Falcon Scott, by contrast, dressed his men in a mixture of wool, canvas, and leather. British tradition held that fur clothing was primitive, uncivilized. Scott's men wore layers of Jaeger wool underwear under windproof cotton shells. Their boots were leather with thin soles. The biggest problem was moisture. Wool absorbs sweat during exertion, and in sub-zero conditions, that sweat freezes when you stop moving. Scott's men were essentially wearing suits of ice by the time they made camp each evening. Amundsen understood something that Scott did not. The key to surviving cold is not adding more insulation. It is managing moisture. The Inuit had known this for thousands of years. Their clothing was designed in layers that allowed water vapor to escape outward while trapping warm air close to the body. When they stopped moving and the sweat began to cool, they could shake the frost out of their outer garments before it melted and soaked through. The sleeping arrangements reflected this same philosophy. Amundsen's men used reindeer skin bags like everyone else, but they maintained them carefully. They turned the bags inside out during rest stops to let frost sublimate in the dry air. They brushed ice crystals from the fur before rolling the bags up. These small, methodical habits made an enormous difference over weeks of travel. Scott's men, on the other hand, often had no time or energy for such maintenance. Their sleeping bags grew heavier and wetter with each passing day. Captain Lawrence Oates, whose frostbitten feet made his famous final walk into the blizzard, could not even get his boots on over his swollen feet in the mornings. His reindeer skin boots had lost their fur and provided almost no insulation. He walked out of the tent in his socks to die. His last words, "I am just going outside and maybe some time," have become one of the most famous lines in the history of exploration. The night Scott's party died, they were 11 miles from a supply depot that could have saved them. A blizzard pinned them in their tent for days. The search party found them 8 months later. Scott was wedged between Wilson and Bowers, the flaps of his sleeping bag thrown back, his coat open. His two companions lay covered in their sleeping bags as if simply dozing. They had run out of fuel and food. They had frozen to death in their sleep, or something close to it. The boundary between sleeping and dying had become vanishingly thin, but the most extraordinary Antarctic sleeping story belongs to a man who survived alone. Douglas Mawson was an Australian geologist who led the Australasian Antarctic expedition of 1911 to 1914. He had established his base at Commonwealth Bay, which turned out to be one of the windiest places on Earth. Average wind speeds reached 50 miles per h-hour, with gusts topping 200. In November 1912, Mawson set out with two companions, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz, on a sledging journey into the interior. They had 16 dogs and 3 sledges loaded with 1,700 pounds of supplies. For the first 5 weeks, things went well. Then, on December 14th, Ninnis and his sledge disappeared into a hidden crevasse, taking with them the team's tent, most of their food, and their best dogs. Mawson and Mertz were 311 miles from base with almost nothing. No tent, barely any food. They improvised a shelter from a spare tent cover and began the desperate march back, killing and eating their remaining dogs as they went. But the dog liver was toxic, loaded with lethal concentrations of vitamin A. Both men began to deteriorate. Their skin peeled off in sheets. Their hair fell out. Mertz became delirious, suffering seizures and biting off one of his own frostbitten fingertips. Each night, Mawson would wrestle Mertz into his sleeping bag and then crawl into his own, listening to his companion crying out in delirium through the darkness. On January 7th, 1913, Mertz died. He was 30 years old. Mawson was now completely alone, over 100 miles from base, with the soles of his feet literally separating from the flesh beneath them. He sawed his sledge in half to reduce weight. He strapped the soles of his feet back on with bandages. And every night for the next 30 days, he crawled into his reindeer skin sleeping bag, alone in the most desolate place on Earth, and somehow found the will to keep going. He later described those nights as the worst part. The physical pain was constant, but it was the loneliness that nearly broke him. One night, a snow bridge collapsed beneath him, and he fell into a crevasse, dangling from a rope attached to his sledge 5 meters above the void. He climbed out, hand over hand, only to have the lip of the crevasse collapse and send him plunging back down. Somehow, starving, frostbitten, With blood pouring from his cracked fingers, he climbed out again, and that night he still set up his tent and slept. Mawson reached his base on February 8, 1913, just hours after the expedition's ship had departed for Australia. He would have to spend another entire winter in Antarctica, recovering from his ordeal. The fact that he survived at all remains one of the most remarkable stories of human endurance ever recorded. But here is the thing that connects all of these stories, something that science has only recently begun to fully understand. When you sleep, your brain deliberately lowers your body's defenses against cold. It widens your blood vessels, pushing warm blood toward your skin. It reduces your metabolic rate. It suppresses shivering during certain sleep stages. Your body essentially assumes that you are in a safe, warm environment and powers down its heating system. During rapid eye movement sleep, the stage where you dream, your body actually stops regulating its temperature altogether. You become briefly something like a cold-blooded animal. If the air around you is cold, your body temperature will drift downward without any defense. This is why sleeping in extreme cold is so much more dangerous than simply being awake in it. Your body's most powerful survival mechanisms shut off precisely when you need them most. Scientists have found that in extremely cold environments, the body appears to compensate by spending less time in REM sleep and more time in lighter sleep stages, where thermoregulation still functions. This means polar sleepers get less of the restorative dreaming, sleep their brains need, even when they manage a full night in their bags. The cold does not just make sleep uncomfortable, it fundamentally changes the architecture of sleep itself, degrading its quality in ways that accumulate over weeks and months. The explorers of the heroic age did not know any of this. They could not explain why they shivered violently for hours in their sleeping bags, but then stopped, or why they sometimes woke feeling paradoxically warm when the temperature had actually dropped further. They were experiencing the limits of human thermoregulation without any theoretical framework to understand it. When they were not traveling, life in the base huts offered some relief. Scott's hut at Cape Evans had bunks arranged along the walls, with a stove in the center burning seal blubber for heat. The men slept in small cubicles, 2 to a space, with their reindeer skin sleeping bags on wooden boards. The temperature inside hovered around freezing, which felt luxurious compared to the conditions on the trail. The huts became their entire world during the long polar night. They decorated their cubicle walls with photographs from home. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with whatever provisions they could improvise. They gave lectures to each other on geology, meteorology, navigation, and biology. Ponting, the expedition photographer, showed magic lantern slides on a makeshift screen. These rituals were not luxuries. They were survival strategies. By keeping the mind engaged and the spirits high, they made it possible for the body to rest when it needed to. Shackleton had pioneered this approach during his earlier Nimrod expedition. He broke the hut space into small cubicles that he gave irreverent names. The men were encouraged to personalize their spaces with whatever they could find. He understood that the illusion of privacy of having a small corner of the world that belonged to you was essential for mental health in confined quarters, and mental health, as the men of the Belgica had already demonstrated, was inseparable from the ability to sleep. But even in the huts, sleep was never truly comfortable. Ice formed on the walls, condensation dripped from the ceiling. The stove could not heat the entire space evenly, though men sleeping farther from it were significantly colder, and the Antarctic schedule itself conspired against rest. During summer, 24 hours of daylight made it difficult to maintain normal sleep patterns. During winter, months of total darkness created the opposite problem, a kind of perpetual drowsiness that was never satisfying. Modern science has a name for this phenomenon. They call it winter over syndrome. Researchers at Antarctic stations today, living in heated, well-lit, well-supplied facilities, still experience significant sleep disruption during the polar winter. Studies show shallow nighttime sleep, frequent awakening, increased insomnia, and excessive daytime sleepiness. Up to 50% of personnel report sleep disturbances during the dark months. The cause appears to be the disruption of circadian rhythms. Your body's internal clock relies on light and dark cycles to regulate the production of melatonin, the hormone that tells you when to sleep. Without the daily signal of sunrise and sunset, the clock begins to drift. Research at the Concordia station in Antarctica found that without normal light cues, the human circadian rhythm shifts to about 25.4 hours. Over weeks and months, this means your sleep schedule slowly rotates, becoming completely disconnected from the external world. And this happens in modern stations with electric lighting, heating systems, comfortable beds, and psychological support. Imagine what it was like for the men on the Belgica in 1898. No electric lights, no understanding of circadian biology, no way to simulate day and night. Just 70 days of unbroken darkness, while sleeping in damp bunks, on a ship creaking and groaning as the ice pressed against its hull. Frederick Cook, the expedition doctor, intuitively grasped what modern sleep science would later confirm. He insisted the men gather around an open fire each evening, not just for warmth but for the light. He understood, without the science to explain it, that firelight was doing something to their minds that went beyond simple comfort. He was, without knowing it, attempting to reset their circadian rhythms. But perhaps the most fascinating adaptation to sleeping in Antarctic cold came from the one group that had already figured it out long before any European set foot on the southern ice. The Inuit and other Arctic indigenous peoples had developed sleeping systems over thousands of years that were remarkably sophisticated. They understood that the ground steals body heat faster than the air, so they slept on raised platforms, never directly on ice or snow. They used layers of caribou and bear fur, with the inner layer's fur facing the body and the outer layer's fur facing out. They kept their sleeping areas small and enclosed, so body heat could warm the space efficiently, and they slept in groups, sharing warmth between bodies. A family of 4 in an igloo could keep the sleeping platform at a comfortable temperature, even when it was -40 outside. The oil lamp, called a kullik, was essential. It burned seal blubber and provided not just light but a steady, gentle heat that could raise the temperature inside an igloo to above freezing even in the worst Arctic conditions. The lamp was tended by the women and was kept burning continuously through the winter months. It dried clothing, melted snow for drinking water, and created a pocket of warmth that made sleep possible. Without it, even the best fur sleeping system would eventually fail. Amundsen was the first Antarctic explorer to take this knowledge seriously. But even he could not fully replicate it. The difference between Arctic and Antarctic conditions is profound. The Arctic has indigenous populations who have adapted over millennia. Antarctica has no indigenous people, no land mammals, no wood for fires, no animals whose fur is designed for southern polar conditions. The explorers had to import everything, including their sleeping technology. The reindeer skin sleeping bag was the best technology available, but it was fundamentally flawed. Reindeer skin works brilliantly in the Arctic because it can be maintained in dry, cold conditions. In Antarctica, where the moisture cycle of sweating, freezing, and thawing was inescapable, the bags degraded rapidly. Cherry Garrett's bag gained so much ice during his Cape Crozier journey that it weighed several times its original mass. And then there was Ernest Shackleton's expedition. When the Endurance was crushed by pack ice in 1915, Shackleton's men were forced to camp on the ice floes themselves. They had reindeer hide sleeping bags that became soaked almost immediately from the constantly changing conditions. They slept on ice that shifted and cracked beneath them, sometimes waking to find open water just feet from their tents. The sleeping bags became sodden. The tents were torn by blizzards. For months, these men lay in wet fur bags on moving ice in temperatures that reached -50 degrees Celsius, not knowing if the ice beneath them would hold until morning. 3 of Shackleton's crew lost their minds during the open boat journey to Elephant Island. The combination of cold, sleep deprivation, and constant danger pushed them past the breaking point. On Elephant Island, while Shackleton sailed for help in the tiny lifeboat James Caird, the remaining 22 men survived for 4.5 months under 2 overturned boats. They lined the floor with stones and spread what remained of their tents over them. Their sleeping bags were by now little more than decaying fur. The fine drift snow found its way through every crack in their shelter, coating the men as they slept. They stuffed sleeping bags and coats against the stone walls to block the wind, packed snow over them, and let it freeze solid. The cook, a man named Charles Green, once put the evening meal inside his sleeping bag to keep it warm until supper. It worked, though everyone complained about the extra reindeer hairs in their food. These small details, almost comic in their absurdity, reveal how completely sleep and survival had merged. The sleeping bag was not just where you rested. It was your kitchen, your storage space, your only refuge from the elements. It was the last barrier between you and death, and yet not a single member of Shackleton's crew died. All 28 men survived. This fact remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of exploration, and it came down, in large part, to Shackleton's understanding of something that went beyond equipment or technique. He understood that sleeping in extreme conditions is as much a psychological challenge as a physical one. Shackleton rotated sleeping positions so that no one person was always in the coldest spot. He made sure the weakest members of the crew received the best sleeping bags. He maintained routines, mealtimes, and watches even when there was nothing to watch for, because the structure itself helped men sleep. He understood that a person who believes they will survive can endure cold that would kill someone who has given up hope. Modern research confirms this intuition. Studies of Antarctic personnel show that psychological state directly affects thermoregulation. Depression and anxiety increase the subjective experience of cold. Positive social connections and a sense of purpose improve sleep quality, even in extreme environments. The body and mind are not separate systems when it comes to surviving the cold. They are deeply, inextricably linked. The toll of Antarctic sleep deprivation on mental health has been devastating throughout history. At least 6 early Antarctic explorers committed suicide, either during or after their expeditions. H. Hjalmar Johansen, who had served as a sledge driver for Amundsen, shot himself on the streets of Oslo in 1913. Edward Nelson, a biologist who had served under Scott, killed himself a decade later. Another of Scott's men, Dennis Lilly, suffered a mental breakdown from which he never recovered. The long polar night did not end when the ship sailed home. For many, the darkness followed them for the rest of their lives. When the German ship Deutschland became trapped in Antarctic ice in 1912, the crew split into rival factions. Some men slept with loaded guns. A wireless operator on Douglas Mawson's expedition became convinced his companions were plotting to murder him. He claimed he had been hypnotized. He was eventually hospitalized for schizophrenia. The combination of sleep deprivation, cold, darkness, and confinement could break the strongest minds. Today, sleeping in Antarctica is a very different experience. Modern expedition sleeping bags use synthetic insulation or advanced down treatments that resist moisture. Inflatable sleeping pads create a barrier between the body and the ice. Vapor barrier liners prevent body moisture from reaching the insulation. Some bags are rated to -40 degrees or colder. The technology has improved beyond anything Cherry Garrard or Mawson could have imagined. The evolution from reindeer skin to modern materials tells a story of slow, hard-won progress. After the heroic age, explorers experimented with eiderdown bags, which were lighter but still vulnerable to moisture. The development of synthetic fills in the mid-20th century was a breakthrough. Because synthetic fibers retain some insulating ability even when wet, goose down is still warmer per ounce, but a soaked down bag is useless. A soaked synthetic bag can still save your life. Modern polar travelers also use a layering system for sleep, much like they do for clothing. A thin silk or synthetic liner goes against the skin. A main sleeping bag provides the primary insulation. An overbag, always synthetic, goes over the top to protect the main bag from frost that accumulates on its outer surface. Between these layers, body moisture migrates outward until it reaches the cold exterior, where it freezes harmlessly on the overbag rather than soaking the down. The sleeping pad beneath is arguably even more important than the bag above. Without a pad, conductive heat loss to the ice is so rapid that no sleeping bag can compensate. Modern pads use closed, cell foam, inflatable chambers, or both, creating an insulating barrier with an R value high enough to sleep on bare ice. Some explorers use 2 pads stacked together for additional protection. The lesson that the Inuit knew for millennia, that the ground will kill you faster than the air, has finally been absorbed by modern technology. But the fundamental challenge remains. Your body still lowers its temperature when you sleep. The wind still tears heat from exposed skin. The ground still conducts warmth away from anything that touches it. And the darkness still plays tricks with your circadian rhythms, making sleep both desperately needed and maddeningly elusive. At the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, temperatures in winter can drop below -100 degrees Fahrenheit. The station is completely cut off from February to October. No flights in or out. Around 50 people spend the winter together in heated modules that maintain a comfortable interior temperature. They have internet access, a gym, a greenhouse for fresh vegetables, and a dedicated cook. And yet, sleep problems remain one of the most common complaints among winter overstaff. Researchers call it polar insomnia. The disrupted light cycles, the isolation, the confined spaces, and the knowledge that you cannot leave, even in an emergency, all combine to make quality sleep remarkably difficult. Some personnel develop what observers describe as the Antarctic stare, a mild hypnotic state where they simply gaze into the middle distance, mentally checked out from their surroundings. Researchers at the European Space Agency study sleep patterns at Concordia Station in Antarctica because the conditions closely parallel what astronauts will face on long-duration space missions to Mars. The same darkness, the same isolation, the same disruption of natural rhythms. Antarctica has become a laboratory for understanding how humans sleep when everything about the environment is hostile to rest, and the findings are remarkable. Without normal day-night cycles, the human circadian clock drifts by nearly an hour per week. Sleep efficiency drops. Slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most restorative stage, decreases significantly during the polar winter. People wake more frequently, take longer to fall asleep, and report feeling unrefreshed even after a full night in bed. But the most striking finding is that these effects reverse almost completely when the sun returns. The moment the first rays of natural light reach the station, sleep patterns begin to normalize. Mood improves. Cognitive performance recovers. It is as if the human body has been waiting, patiently and faithfully, for the signal that the world is turning again. Think about that. The next time you close your eyes tonight, somewhere in Antarctica right now, someone is trying to sleep. They might be in a heated research station with all the comforts of modern technology, or they might be in a tent on a glacier. wrapped in a sleeping bag rated to temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. Either way, they are fighting the same battle that Cherry Garrod fought, that Mawson fought, that the men of the Belgica fought. The battle to let go, to close your eyes in a place that will kill you if your defenses fail, and trust that your body knows what it is doing. To fall asleep while your core temperature drops and your blood vessels dilate and your shivering stops, and believe that morning will come. The honest answer is that we still don't fully understand how they did it. We know the equipment they used. We know the conditions they endured. We can measure the metabolic processes and the hormonal cycles and the neurological pathways. But the thing that kept those men alive through nights of -70 degrees in frozen sleeping bags, the thing that let them close their eyes and trust that they would open them again, that is something beyond the reach of any instrument. Maybe it was courage, maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the simple refusal to let the cold win, or maybe it was something even more fundamental, maybe the human body, forged through millions of years of evolution in every climate on Earth, simply knows how to sleep. Even in the most hostile conditions imaginable, even when every law of physics says you should not survive the night. Whatever it is, it worked. From the Belgica in 1898 to the Cape Crozier journey in 1911 to Mawson's impossible solo trek in 1913, men slept in Antarctica and lived to tell about it. Not all of them, not always comfortably, but enough of them survived to push the boundary of what we thought possible and to teach us something profound about the relationship between the human body and the coldest place on Earth. If you are drifting off right now, that is exactly what you should be doing. Your body is doing something ancient and remarkable. It is lowering your temperature, slowing your heart, quieting your mind. It is trusting the darkness, just like those explorers trusted the Antarctic night. And tomorrow, just like the sun returning to the South Pole after months of absence, you'll wake up and the world will still be here. Sleep well. The mysteries will be here when you wake up, and so will we.